Charlotte Delbo, writing Auschwitz in code to survive Auschwitz-Birkenau, Poland, spring 1943. The barracks are silent except for the breathing of exhausted women. Some are already dead. Others are too far gone to know the difference. The SS guards have made their final rounds. The searchlights sweep, the dogs settle, and in the dark, a woman begins to write. She has no paper, not officially. Paper is a luxury here, where humans are reduced to numbers tattooed on skin. But Charlotte Delbo has learned to steal minutes the way others steal bread. She has fragments, the backs of work orders, torn margins of German language notices. She writes in a hand so small it takes a magnifying glass to read. She writes in code. She writes in poetry. She writes in the only language the SS cannot confiscate, the interior language of witness. If they find her pages, she dies. She knows this. She has watched women die for less, for a piece of turnip, for looking the wrong way at a guard, for the crime of having a body that survived one more day than the Nazis planned. She writes anyway, because Charlotte Delbo understands something that will take the rest of the world decades to grasp. She understands that the true weapon of the death camp is not the gas chamber. It is erasure, the systematic destruction of the record, the transformation of human beings into ash and silence. And she has decided, quietly and ferociously, that she will not be silent. This is the story of how a French theater secretary became one of the most important witnesses of the Holocaust. How she survived Auschwitz not by being extraordinary, but by insisting every single day that the truth deserved to be written down. And how the world ignored her for years until it could no longer look away. Charlotte Delbo was born on August 10, 1913, in Vigneux-sur-Seine, a working-class suburb south of Paris. Her father was a metalworker. Her mother kept the house. There was nothing in her childhood that suggested she would one day become a figure that literature professors would argue about for the next 80 years. She was smart, though. Relentlessly, uncomfortably smart. She devoured books in a household where books were a luxury. She earned her baccalaureate. She moved to Paris. In Paris in the 1930s, a young woman from the suburbs with a sharp mind and no family connections had limited options. Charlotte found her way into the world of theater. She became the personal secretary of Louis Jouvet, one of the most celebrated theater directors in France. Jouvet was demanding, brilliant, and exacting. Working for him was a graduate education in the precision of language, the economy of words, the way a single sentence could carry the weight of everything that was not said. She was also becoming politically conscious in a decade when political consciousness was unavoidable. The Spanish Civil War, the rise of fascism. Charlotte joined the French Communist Party. She believed in collective action. She believed that ordinary people had the power to resist. She was 27 years old when the German army marched into Paris on June 14, 1940. The occupation transformed everything. Jouvet took his theater company on tour to South America to keep them safe. Charlotte could have gone with him. She chose not to. She chose to stay in France. She chose the resistance. What exactly Charlotte did in the resistance in 1941 and 1942 is not documented in granular detail. She was part of the network connected to her political circles. She distributed clandestine newspapers. She moved information. She was part of the invisible infrastructure that kept the underground alive. On March 2nd, in 1942, Charlotte and her husband, Georges Dudac, were arrested by the French police. Both were members of the communist resistance. Both were handed to the Germans. Georges was shot on May 23rd, 1942. Charlotte was told of his execution in her prison cell. She was 28 years old. She was a widow. And she was still under German arrest. For months she was held, moved between prisons, processed through the machinery of Nazi administration. Then, on January 24th, 1943, she was loaded onto a train at the Bourget-Drancy station with 229 other French women. None of them knew with certainty where they were going. They were told nothing. This was part of the method. Uncertainty was a weapon. The train traveled east for 3 days. On January 27th, 1943, it stopped at Auschwitz. The arrival at Auschwitz is one of the scenes that Charlotte will describe in such precise, terrible detail that readers decades later will report having to put her books down and walk away. But we need to understand what she walked into, because it gives meaning to everything that came after. Auschwitz-Birkenau in January 1943 was at the height of its operation. The main camp, Auschwitz I, had been established since 1940. The extermination camp, Birkenau, was processing thousands of people per week. The selection on the platform, the separation of those deemed fit for labor from those who were not, was already routine. Charlotte and the 229 women with her were a specific category. They were French political prisoners, not Jews. They were sent to Auschwitz, not for immediate extermination, but for forced labor under conditions designed to kill through exhaustion, starvation, cold, and disease. The distinction mattered in bureaucratic terms. In human terms, it mattered very little. The mortality rate among the group was catastrophic. They were tattooed. Charlotte received the number 31661. She was no longer Charlotte Delbo. She was a number. a unit of labor with an expiration date set by the system around her. The camp at Birkenau operated on deliberate dehumanization. The prisoner had to surrender not just freedom, but selfhood. Name, hair, clothing, individual appearance, every marker of personal identity was stripped away. The architecture of the camp was designed to make you feel small, exposed, and without privacy. The food was calibrated to weaken the body over months, while keeping it just functional enough to work. The work itself was often pointless, designed not to produce anything but to break the spirit through exhaustion. Charlotte worked in the marshes. She hauled stones. She stood at roll call in temperatures that fell to minus 20 Celsius, while the SS counted and recounted and counted again. She watched women die next to her in the ranks and was not permitted to move. She also watched everything with the eyes of a writer trained by one of France's greatest directors in the observation of human behavior. She began composing in her head before she ever found a way to put words to paper. This is important. The first act of witness was internal. Charlotte rehearsed observations, descriptions, and fragments of testimony in her memory the way an actor rehearses lines. She knew she could not always write. She knew the SS searched the barracks, so she held the words inside her. When she could write, she wrote quickly and small. Some accounts suggest she was helped by other prisoners who watched for guards. The women in her group developed a culture of mutual protection. She was not writing alone. She was writing on behalf of a community that understood what was being done to them. The writing served multiple psychological functions. For Charlotte, it was a form of dissociation. By positioning herself as a witness, she created a small interior distance between herself and the horror. She was not only the woman hauling stones in the marsh, she was also the writer observing the woman hauling stones. This second self, the observer, could survive things the primary self might not. It was also an act of defiance. Every word was a declaration that this was happening, that it was being recorded, that someone, somewhere would know. The group of 230 French women who arrived together on January 27, 1943, had, by the spring of 1945, been reduced to 49 survivors. Charlotte Delbo was one of the 49. The details of her survival across 27 months in the camp system are fragmentary. She survived the death marches of January and February 1945, as the Germans evacuated Auschwitz ahead of the advancing Soviet army. She survived Ravensbrück concentration camp, where she was transferred. She was released through the mediation of the Swedish Red Cross on April 23, 1945. She arrived in Sweden barely alive. She weighed, by her own account, something close to nothing. Her body had consumed itself. She was taken in by Swedish families. She was fed slowly, carefully, the way you feed someone who has forgotten what it means to be full. And almost immediately, she began to write. She had been composing in her head for 2 years. The words came out of her in a torrent. But she made a decision that would define her literary legacy, and that would also postpone her recognition for years. She decided not to publish immediately. She wrote. She completed work. She revised. But she told herself and others that the world was not ready, that she was not sure the writing was ready, that she needed to process what she had experienced before she could expose it. Some scholars believe this was genuine artistic caution. Others suggest it was something more complex. A writer who knew that her testimony was so raw and uncompromising that publishers and readers would flinch. France in the late 1940s and through the 1950s was not, as a cultural matter, ready to fully reckon with what had happened. The country was engaged in the difficult business of reconstruction and the complicated mythology of the resistance. Charlotte returned to France. She resumed working in theater. She wrote plays. She found her footing in the post-war world with a particular difficulty of all concentration camp survivors, which is the difficulty of being present in a world that has moved on while you have not. She did not speak publicly of Auschwitz for a long time. The silence was not denial, it was calibration. Meanwhile, her manuscript sat in drawers. It was not until 1965 that her first major work was published. None of Us Will Return, the first volume of what would become the trilogy Auschwitz and After, appeared through Editions de Minuit, the same publisher that had issued resistance literature during the occupation. It appeared with a preface by the novelist and fellow survivor François Mauriac. The book was received with critical respect and public shock. Charlotte's writing defied every expectation of what Holocaust testimony was supposed to look like. It was not confessional in the conventional sense. It was not a linear narrative. It was fragmented, poetic, disorienting. She wrote in the present tense, placing the reader inside the experience rather than at a safe historical distance. She described the morning roll call in temperatures of minus 20 Celsius, and the women who died standing upright in the ranks, and how the living held the dead in place so the count would be right, because a wrong count meant starting over and starting. Over in that cold meant more dying. She wrote about the snow and what the snow looked like and how the color of snow changed for someone who had spent months staring at it from inside hunger and exhaustion. She wrote about water, the obsession with water, the thirst that was not just physical but ontological. a thirst for something that the camp systematically denied. She did not look away, and she did not let the reader look away. The second volume, Useless Knowledge, appeared in 1970. The third, The Measure of Our Days, also in 1970. Together, they constitute one of the most important literary documents of the 20th century. She also wrote plays that engaged with historical atrocity, Qui rapportera ses paroles, or Who Will Carry the Word, dramatized the experience of the French women in Auschwitz, and became an important work in the theater of testimony. The question of Charlotte Delbo's reputation is a complicated one, and it is impossible to discuss without acknowledging the particular way the world treats women who bear witness to atrocity. She was recognized, she received attention, her books were translated, scholars wrote about her, but the recognition was always somehow calibrated below the weight of what she had accomplished. She was mentioned in footnotes to discussions dominated by male survivors. She was described as a poet when she was also a historian, a philosopher, and a documentarian. The fragmented, unconventional form of her writing was sometimes treated as a feminine attribute, a softness, rather than as a deliberate and sophisticated structural choice. She had survived Auschwitz. She had preserved her testimony through 2 years in a death camp. She had written 3 volumes of witness that rewrote what literary testimony could be, and she spent decades fighting to be taken as seriously as the seriousness of her subject demanded. Charlotte Delbo died on March 1, 1985 in Paris. She was 71 years old. She did not live to see the full flowering of her reputation. In the years and decades after her death, her work has been increasingly recognized as foundational. Scholars of Holocaust literature, trauma theory, and women's history have returned to her again and again. The trilogy has never been out of print in French. The English translation, published in full by Yale University Press, is now standard reading in university courses across the world. Her number was 31661. She chose to be Charlotte Delbo instead. And she was. There's a passage in None of Us Will Return that has been quoted many times because it does what the best writing does, which is to make the impossible suddenly legible. She describes learning, upon her return, that she has survived. And she writes about the strange doubling of herself into the woman who lived through Auschwitz and the woman who came after. 2 people in one body. One of them dead and one of them alive, and neither entirely sure which is which. This is what trauma does. This is what the camp was designed to do. To create a fracture in the self so deep that even survival feels like a kind of loss. Charlotte wrote about that fracture. She named it. She put language around it. And in doing so, she gave language to an experience that millions of people shared, and that the world had no vocabulary for. That is the work of a writer. That is the work of a witness. That is the work of Charlotte Delbo. If this story moved you, if you found yourself understanding something today that you did not understand before, please consider hitting the like button. It takes 2 seconds, and it tells the algorithm that these stories matter. Subscribe to this channel so you don't miss the next one. We have more stories like this, stories of ordinary people who made impossible choices in impossible times and left the world different because they did. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from. It matters to know that these stories are reaching people around the world. And thank you. Thank you for keeping the memory alive. That's what Charlotte Delbo spent her life asking of us. Let's not let her down.